So Theo asked this question. People looking at horoscopes, why does it seem like it's sometimes accurate? And how do we deal with that mindset scripturally? And I actually asked him some clarifying questions. See, he's talking about Christians or believers that would look at their horoscopes that don't think that there's anything wrong with that. So this is actually a huge issue that's tied into a much bigger issue. A huge issue tied into a much bigger issue. So I'm trying to figure out how far back do I want to go. So we'll start out with scripture. The whole thing of horoscope is tied into divination and tied into spiritualism, which was talked about throughout scripture. There are two ways to access the spiritual world. Now, John chapter 10 says that Jesus is the door. Anybody who comes in and out by the door comes out through him, but anybody who comes in any other way is a thief and a robber. So there's only one legitimate access to spiritual activity, and that is Jesus Christ. Any other access to spiritual activity is a thief and a robber, is satanic, is demonic. Jesus said that Satan is the thief that gets caught. And so the thief comes only to kill, to steal, and to destroy. When you say kill and steal, if you separate them, you don't say kill. So steal, kill, and destroy. But Jesus has come to have life. Coming in by any other way than the gate, the door, Jesus himself, that one is a thief and a robber, is operating according to Satan's principles, which is going to steal from their spiritual life. It's going to kill their spiritual life. It's going to destroy things in their spiritual life. This is why God was so adamant about how to deal with mediums, witches, spiritists, diviners, people that use divination, people that access spiritual activity in any way other than by his spirit. He told the Israelites that they were to kill them. Now, we are no longer living the Mosaic law. There were parts of that Mosaic law that was a governmental, a national law, a public law of the land that was telling the people how to govern the people. It was not what an individual did to an individual, but what the government did to the people. And so we don't have the death penalty. Governments, some do, many don't, but that's on them. That has nothing to do with it. So what do we do when someone would have been under the death penalty under the Mosaic law? That's when we begin to separate ourselves from them so that we don't become defiled by their activity. So when we find someone that is operating in these false spiritual things, if we give ourselves to those things, to that activity, we end up getting caught up in that activity and we begin to submit ourselves to the spirits that are ruling that. So horoscope is a form of divination, looking to natural patterns to divine supernatural information, looking to natural patterns to divine, to find supernatural information. And so you can look at the stars and the way things are moving, and they give some foundation for what's going to happen in some people's lives. Now, some of that is just guesswork, and some of it is so general that it could apply to almost anybody. So that is there. Now, horoscopes, if any of you have read, well, this is the common traits of someone that's born under this sign, and this is the common traits of someone that's born under this sign. To some extent, sometimes it fits, sometimes it doesn't fit at all. It's guesswork. So sometimes it's going to fit, sometimes it's not going to fit. It never fits all the time. It's not always true. And so you have to be careful of that. Now, when somebody is giving like daily horoscopes, individualized daily horoscopes, then the question is, well, what's their source? If they're just making it up because it's a way for them to make money, and there's no spiritual source there, it's going to be completely guesswork. Sometimes, can you hit it? Can you just guess? Oh, something like this is going to happen, and be very general. Oh, something's going to happen in your workplace today, or something's going to happen in a relationship today. What day does something not happen in a relationship? Of course, something's going to happen in a relationship. It can just be guesswork, but sometimes there are spirits that are speaking to these people, and they give very accurate information because they know what their plans are. They know what's already been set in motion. They know what's going to happen. And so individualized horoscopes from somebody that is operating in spiritual powers can end up being accurate because the person is a psychic. They're operating with demonic spirits, and they're seeing information. They're seeing things that are there. They're seeing what the spirits are planning on accomplishing, or they're seeing patterns that maybe the person doesn't know about, and they're prognosticating what could happen. John Paul talks about this in Prophets versus Psychics, and understanding the difference between the prophetic gift and the psychic gift when it's a real gift that is being used. Now, the gift comes from God, but people use it in the wrong way. And so it ends up taking them into bad places. It's the same thing as mediums. It's the same thing as witches, as Ouija boards. And sometimes you're just playing around and somebody's pushing the thing around. Sometimes there are actually spirits that are involved that are causing things to happen. We have to be careful. We shouldn't play with any of that stuff. The only reason we would play with that stuff is because we don't trust God. The only reason that we would look for another source of supernatural activity is because we don't trust God. We think that God is not giving it to us fast enough, that He's not able or He doesn't want to. We don't trust that He actually has our best interests involved. And so we look for some other way. We look for some other path. We look for some other outlet for that spiritual hunger that He placed within us that is intended to only be filled by Him. And that is the problem. It's a lack of faith. It's a lack of faith in who God is. It's a lack of faith in His capacity that we would go to these other things. It's the same, it's what sin is. It's a lack of faith. We don't trust that God actually has our best interests in mind when He tells us appropriate sexual activity, so we're going to go have sexual activity wherever we want. It's the same thing. We don't trust that God's actually going to provide those things that we need if we seek first His kingdom and His righteousness. So we seek Him for ourselves, and we steal and we lie and we manipulate so that we can get more than what we deserve, than what is coming to us. We begin to take things into our own hands. We begin to violate scriptural principles. And when it comes to spiritual activity, if we think that we know how God should operate better than God, and God doesn't line up with our way of doing it, we start forcing His hand, or we start finding another way to fill those needs. And this is a lack of trust. Now, salvation is faith. It's by grace you've been saved through faith, trust. Without faith, you cannot please God. But the one who seeks to please God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of those that seek Him. This is Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6. If there is no faith, there is no salvation. Faith, we've misunderstood faith. We've redefined faith in modern day to mean the think. We think that because we agree with certain principles, certain spiritual principles, that we have faith. That is not faith. Faith is not thinking. Faith is trust. And actually, whenever you're reading in Scripture and you just take the word faith, just read trust instead of faith, and you'll understand the intent of Scripture a lot better, because we've changed what that word means in our common vernacular, because we've so exalted reason and logic above reality that we don't see anything else as valid. We think that what we think is true. We think that if we think something, that we believe it or that we know it. But just because you think something doesn't mean you know it. And just because you think something doesn't mean you believe it. If we believed God, we would trust him and we would live his way. Hebrews chapter 3 and 4, take a look at how the writer of Hebrews uses the word for believe and the word for obey interchangeably. You can't separate them. John chapter 3, towards the end of John chapter 3, he uses the word for obey and believe interchangeably. These are interchangeable concepts. If you do not obey, you do not believe. And so we go and we try to find our own way because we don't trust God. If we trusted God, we would actually do it his way. And so the problem with these things, one, you're opening up the door to demonic spirits. When you begin to read horoscopes, when you begin to get your palm read, you go to psychics, that whole thing, it opens up the door to demonic spirits, which is a real issue. You can be demonized even as a believer. We're not going to go into the theology of that. Maybe that's another fireside chat that we can have at another time. But you can be demonized as a believer. I mean, somebody once said a Christian can have whatever they want, but why would they want a demon? But we choose them and we open ourselves up to them by the choices that we make. So don't do that. You open yourself up to that. That's one. Number two, it's sin because it's not trusting God. We don't actually trust God to speak. We need to find the information our own way. We don't trust that God's going to say everything that we want him to say. And so we think that we know what we need to hear better than God does. And so instead of just trusting what he does tell us, we start to pursue finding our secret information any way that we can. And we've allowed our hunger that's intended to be a hunger for God and for his spirit to become a hunger for secret, hidden knowledge, which is going to lead us down a path. Whenever it's not anchored in love for God and passion for him, it'll always lead us into sin. And sin leads to death. And Galatians chapter 6 says very clearly, do not be deceived. God will not be mocked. Whatever you sow, that will you also reap. If you sow to the flesh corruption, you will reap death. Now, if you sow to the Spirit, you will reap life. Whatever you sow, you will reap. To think that you can sow sin, you can sow to the flesh and not reap corruption, not reach death, is to mock God and is to be deceived. We have to realize how real this is, how important this is. It's not a little thing for us to be playing around with spiritual activity. It's important that we recognize it. It's important that we trust God because that is faith. That's a great question. Thank you for asking that one.